Yo.
Presenting Benny Goodman and his music.
All right, good evening, everybody. We are rolling. Hey, Kurt. Hey, Evie. Hey, Chris. Happy birthday to Evie. Hey, everybody. Hey, Bob Garton. Hey, Debbie in Georgia. Hey, everybody. I don't think Miles has heard the music yet. He probably would have showed up by now. All danceable. Hey, grandkids galore. Glad to have you. Hey, Octavio, Timothy, and Mom. Hey, everybody.
Blue skies.
Hey, Gene. Hey, Daddy, Laura, Sarah, Heather, Timothy, Gene. Hey, Bridget and Casey. Hey, Karen. Hey, Susan. Evening, Amy. Hey, everybody. I don't think Miles has noticed the music yet. Maybe I'll turn it up a bit. Miles? You're over here, huh? He's standing guard. Lily has been hiding out under the couch most of today. Hey, Katie and John. Hey, Larry, Susan, Eileen. Hey, Gene and Karen. Here comes the Miles Monster. Hey, Chuck. Hey, Gene. Lily, I don't think is going to come out and introduce herself tonight. She's still doing that cat thing where they're in a new territory, so they're just kind of hiding out for the first few days. As they do. Still waiting to see if this place is okay or what. She's had a lot of upheaval the last week. Been a long, long car ride. She's in a whole new place with different kinds of floors than she's used to. Plus roommates, she hasn't had those before. Hello, Natalie. So, she, last I checked, was still hiding out under the couch over here. She did some time in the window earlier. Hey, Jolene. Get a lot of been a while people tonight. Well, welcome back. Where you been at? Hey, Sherlock, hey, Emily. Well, we're always glad to have you back. Always glad you came. You can come back, baby. Rock and roll never forgets. Speaking of rock and roll, I am really enjoying the Electric Mayhem show, the Muppet Band. The album especially is a really good rock and roll album. It's like Mad Dogs and Englishmen vibes. Evening, Katie. Hey, Cindy. 4.5 week road trip. Whoa! It's longer than I go. I barely remembered it was Thursday today, honestly. It's been a week. Been a couple of weeks. Hey, euphonium section. Yeah, Dolly Parton has a pretty good track listing for her rock album coming out. I think there'll be one song out for it out tonight. But the Electric Mayhem album, genuinely a great rock and roll album. Hey Diane, hey Ava, hey Gwendolyn. Yeah, I barely remembered it was Thursday. I spent most of the day trying to read up on a pirate that I need to know more about. And I'm kind of embarrassed not to know more about him to start with. But the things that come up when you're doing a New York Cemeteries book, we just didn't have that many pirates in Chicago. I mean, we had Captain Streeter. All the while and wherefore, all I'll ever care for with all. Maybe I'll just tell the pirate story I'm working on as one of the morning mini tours coming up. Hey, Grandma Belle. I'll tell the stars above you who say again I love you with all my heart. Hey, Megan, here's hoping. Hey, Jenna. All right, I'll see you tomorrow night. There's shipwrecks in Lake Michigan, yeah. To call them pirate wrecks would be a whole other thing. Natalie, I do enjoy old lesbian dime novels, the ones that Lawrence Block was writing under pseudonyms back in the 50s.
Jenny Walk, Benny Goodman and his orchestra.
Welcome along, everybody. Good evening all around. I got a few people coming out to Romeoville tomorrow, huh? I'll be leaving right from Romeoville off to the Effin retreat. And then I got a long day driving on Sunday. Yeah, Lawrence Block's old pulp fiction is some of the only fiction I've read the last few years. I don't like books. Books are for squares, man. I only read rock biographies and ancient newspapers. Susan, Miles has been floating around here a bit. He was gonna come up and then he didn't. Priya, I'm not sure where Priya's at right now. Lily is hiding under the couch. She still hasn't really come out. Yeah, Marie Lawrence Block, under various pseudonyms, was writing lesbian pulps back in the 50s. Among other 50s-style porn pulps. They're pretty tame by today's standards. I don't mind walls of text. I wrote books for so many years that I don't even like them anymore. I go into bookstores now and it's just like, oh, they don't have any of my books, but they have a big display of this author who was a total jerk to me. Dress up like pirates? I don't know, Casey. It's not 2002. I guess it's been long enough that it could come back around by now. All right, we're going to let Benny Goodman do one more tune for us here live from the Congress Hotel in downtown Chicago. Confetti for Bella, who has now arrived.
in the same
This is my latest Apple Watch band that I decided I wanted to go hot pink and black. I got like a whole drawer full of them now. Marie, a lot of them have been republished for Kindle now. So you can get them for like $2.99. Hey. Glad to have you, Marine. Katie doesn't want to be a pirate. She wants to sing and dance. Hey, Jeff. Hey, Leah. Yeah, Susan, I think I had ADHD back before it was cool. Before we even had the H yet. The letter H had not yet been discovered. I think it's a lot more common among my generation and that before mine than was previously thought. They just thought I was bad. Debbie, Lily is secluded herself under the couch. You know, cats in new places, they want to only cover a small area to patrol at a time. But there hasn't been any fighting with the new ones. Well, yeah, that's awesome. Natalie, my generation is that neon generation in between the millennials and the Xers. We were the generation who wore an awful lot of neon to elementary school, completely unironically. We were gnarly. Nah, Natalie, if you're 83, that's the upper end of the millennials. It's 82 and after. But all right.
Music by Benny Goodman is being presented from the Joseph Urban Room of the Congress Hotel in downtown.
All right, that's Benny Goodman coming to you live from the Joseph Urban Room of the Congress Hotel in downtown Chicago. That's it for Benny Goodman. I think it's time that we start properly. All right, welcome along, everybody. I'm Adam from Mysterious Chicago Tours. I have been a tour guide and a historian here in Chicago for going on 20 years now. I've got about a dozen Chicago history books out, including Mysterious Chicago, the book, H.H. Holmes, The True History of the White City Devil, there it is, Jerks in Chicago History, Speaking Ill of the Dead, Murder Maps USA, New from Thames and Hudson, and out just last year, Graceland Cemeteries, Chicago Stories, Symbols, and Secrets, which I'm really hoping the package that just arrived at my post office box. It was supposed to come here, but I got a package that seems to be the books in time for my talk about Graceland Cemetery in Romeoville tomorrow night. So yeah, I know some of you are joining me for that library talk out in Romeoville tomorrow. I will have copies of the book there, at least as long as everything goes correctly with that delivery. One more thing to add to the list. I also got my annual IRS letter saying I owe them more than I paid them. But it's a lot less than last year. It's really kind of a relief to open it up this time. But okay, today we are going to be talking today about true crime tales in Chicago cemeteries. Now, this is the kind of tour that I can only really do virtually. I mean, I do run true crime tours at Graceland Cemetery. I could do one at Rose Hill Cemetery, probably one at Oak Woods as well. But to really do this right, we have to go bopping around from cemetery to cemetery to cemetery all over the Chicagoland area. We could get a bus, or we could just do it virtually. And so, that's what we're going to do. We're going to start up here in Rogers Park at what some people consider the only graveyard in Chicago. It depends on how pedantic you want to get about things. So there are those who say that if it's not attached to a church, it's not a graveyard. The only real graveyards are churchyards. If it's not a churchyard, then it's just a cemetery or a family plot. Frankly, that is the kind of pedantic nonsense up with which I shall not put, but this particular one does meet the definition. It's about the only one in Chicago that does. This is St. Henry's, which is now attached to St. Aloysius Church. I think it's Aloysius. or one of those. I kind of get my saints confused now and then. But in any case, it used to be St. Henry's, a church up here on Devon Avenue in what is now Rogers Park. Well, West Ridge, well, once again, depending on who you ask. West Rogers Park, West Ridge. In the days when the story in question took place, it was all strictly called Rogers Park in the press. There's some really interesting names in this place. Like, here's Margaretha Sinner. And nearby, near Margaretha Sinner, is Anton Kill, and Maria Kill, and Margaretha Kill, and right next to them is Mary Kill, whose middle initial I really hope is F. Mary F. Kill. Move over from the Kills just a second, passing Mary Kill, and Elizabeth Kill, all the Kills. And right over here is Henry Muno. Now, on the walking tours that they do of this cemetery occasionally, they say that Henry Muno was murdered when he was on his way to this church back in the 1880s. That's not exactly the way it happened. Henry Muno had been hanging out overnight at an illegal roadhouse. At the time, this area was not yet incorporated. It was a dry area. You couldn't legally sell liquor in the area. But there were 2 or 3 illegal roadhouses operating just in the general vicinity. He was at a place over by the Henry Rogers cabin itself, which was over at about Western and Toohey. And he had gone out drinking with a few people, and then he failed to come home. Some other people who were walking home the next day found him lying there dead with a bloody handkerchief nearby, realized what had happened, came up to his house, and found his son sitting on the porch, and they said, "Is your father home?" This is a very weird situation on their part. They did not handle this well. But the son said, "No, he didn't come home last night. Let me go ask my uncles." They said, "Well, never mind. He's not going to be there. He's dead." Breaking it to him gently there. So Henry Muno had been murdered by somebody passing through. He was presumably robbed, though he didn't have any money left in his pocket, so it was hard to know how much he might have been taken for. There was a bloody handkerchief nearby. The handkerchief proved to match to a drifter who had been rolling through town and working down at what is now St. Boniface Cemetery. That guy disappeared that night. The murder was never officially solved. Everybody just assumed it had been the guy who disappeared. I think there's another possibility, though, is that the guy who disappeared just came upon the body, thought, "Oh no, what's going on here?" and started trying to dab the body with his own handkerchief, then realized, "Oh no, everybody's going to think that I did it," and then split. That would have been my defense if I were his criminal lawyer in any case. But he is now up here at St. Rogers Cemetery. This is one of the far-flung ones that we don't really get to too often. There aren't really enough stories in here to do a walking tour. I have also never quite done a walking tour at Bohemian National Cemetery, a few blocks to the west on Pulaski. But there's this gravestone right here for a young woman named Wanda Stopa, who is sometimes said to be the youngest woman to become a state's attorney in Illinois. Which she was, though. To call her a state's attorney, her job was a little bit more like a paralegal, really. But she was an assistant to one of the state's attorneys doing paralegals type work. But in the process, she started hanging out. She was going downtown a lot, and there's all these old stories about you go downtown from her house, which was nearly 6 blocks from downtown, and the city will eat you alive. It wasn't really the city that ate her alive, it was the artists. She fell in with a gang of artists. For a while, she was married to a guy who was claimed to be a Russian count. But then she fell in love with this other guy, Mr. Smith, who was kind of became her benefactor. He's kind of set her up in the Bohemian scene. He was working as a banker himself, but by night he was a Bohemian, and she fell completely in love with him. He had led her on quite a bit, but then he started working to try to get rid of her. He sent her out to New York for a while. She started writing him all these rather pathetic letters saying, "Even if I can just have you once a week, that's enough for me. I'll take it, just an hour a week. You don't have to leave your wife or anything." But then she changed her mind and decided that she would murder Mr. Smith's wife. So she came back to Chicago with a firearm and a box of arsenic-laced candies. This is Mrs. Smith, the one that she was going to be killing, but when she showed up at her house, she misfired and ended up killing the gardener instead. So there became a massive manhunt. Queer story of love told after attack. She was eventually captured in a motel some way away, at which she had eaten all of the candies herself. This is a picture of her funeral. Her house was at 1505 Augusta, right just about at Wicker Park, a little closer into the city than Wicker Park. It was a huge story at the time. There's only a couple of pictures of her, somewhat surprisingly. It's one of a number of stories where people die of eating poison candy in the city of Chicago. There's really quite a few of those. And since we're talking about poison, elsewhere in the same cemetery here at Bohemian National, this is the family plot of the Roswell family, who started dying one by one in the early 20th century. Mr. Roswell died, Mrs. Roswell died, a couple of the sisters and brothers died. Now, the police blamed this on a guy by the name of Herman Billick, who was a fortune teller by trade, and also had ingratiated himself into the family. The police got a kid named Jerry Roswell, to be their main witness. He said himself that he was sure that what had happened was that Mr. Billick had fallen in love with Mrs. Roswell, and he had seen them plotting to kill everybody. And then he had seen Mr. Billick give her some strange white powders. But the trouble with this story is, well, Herman Billick was eventually sentenced to be hanged, but the case, as it often was in Chicago, is the police had picked him as the victim because they knew that they could probably get him convicted. Now, he was a foreign guy, he was a fortune teller, everything about that just seemed like the kind of guy who would be easy to get a conviction on. Whether or not he actually did it didn't really matter to them. Now, shortly after the conviction, Jerry, the main witness, came forth and said, none of that ever happened. All that stuff I confessed to, I said that because the police said if I didn't, they would hang me. They said that they had evidence that it was me, and if I didn't pin it all on Mr. Billick, then they were going to pin it on me. Now, Herman was eventually pardoned. Died just shortly thereafter, but he at least was never hanged. The balance of evidence was really one of the daughters of the family. Emma Roswell was probably the one doing the poisoning. This has all been covered in much more detail than I can do in a short tour here by this book, Poison by Steve Shookus. And he went right into this, fully expecting to be writing a book about Herman Billick, the serial killer, then came to realize just the extent to which the coroner and the chief of police in those days were equal parts corrupt and incompetent, I think. And honestly, the cases that I work with these guys, with Coroner Hoffman and Inspector Shippey, who we'll talk about later on, every case that these guys worked on should have at least been a commuted sentence just because of the fact that they were involved in it. They were that bad. Let's move back over a little bit. We're going to hop over to Graceland Cemetery, which I'll be talking about tomorrow in Romeoville. Sorry, some of that bourbon went down the wrong pipe. I have some water over here? I do not. Well, first, we got Lavinia Lane here. I can't just hover on Lavinia and not say anything. Lavinia Lane is the Graceland witch. After she beat up Judge Van H. Higgins in his chamber, he let the story leak out that she had taken a couple of bodies of children out of her mausoleum and boiled them in her kitchen. Which I really think was probably... Well, here are I get this footage I use is the whole plot. This is a cousin of the Carter Harrison family who died during a terrible snowstorm in the 1860s. Next to him, this terrific one, George A. Meshes, whose epitaph reads, "I would do it again." You do it again, George. But over in front, this is Carter Harrison, who was mayor of Chicago over several terms in the late 19th century. Some people compared him a little bit to Andrew Jackson. He had that kind of folksiness, that kind of I'm just as dumb as you kind of vibe. Newspapers were pretty rough on the guy. Here's the Chicago Journal talking about thieves on the run. He was up for re-election in 1893. Thugs flocking to Chicago from every quarter. Carter Harrison's nomination, the primary cause. Criminals alive to the prospects of a wide-open town. Police powerless against the lawless crowds. Harrison's defeat and the election of a citizen's mayor, the only remedy possible. The very same day that the Journal ran this article, the Chicago Tribune ran their first article about H.H. Holmes, the Devil in the White City guy. Now, they refrained at the over at the Chicago Journal from saying "we told you so" after Carter Harrison was elected and then was assassinated. He was shot to death in his house on Ashland Avenue. A guy by the name of Patrick Prendergast showed up thinking that he was going to be named corporation counsel. He claimed that he had a secret plan to raise the railroad crossing tracks over the crossings. That was a big issue of the day, is that people were getting crushed by trains going by at busy intersections. You notice a lot of times now the trains go up over the intersection. But there was a lot of, where are we going to find the money for that? Prendergast said he had a way to do it without spending any money. He could never remember what that plan was, but he had it in his head that Harrison was going to make him corporation counsel. And when he didn't, he just shot him to death. This is the house as it looked. Now, it was actually when the house was under construction. It was H.H. Honore's house. When it was being built, he had trouble with some kind of labor trouble with the roofers, so he just had his friends come and help build the roof by promising them that, hey, from up there, we'll have a really good view of the public hanging that's going on. It would have been either William Jackson or Albert Staub, the two guys who were hanged in right in the middle of what is now Ashland between Taylor and Polk. This would, in fact, have been a pretty good view if you were into that kind of thing. Prendergast was eventually hanged. Even the county physician said he was schizophrenic. If he had assassinated anybody else, he probably would have gone to an asylum. But instead, he ended up at Calvary Cemetery. And actually even has a marker there, which is very unusual for stuff like this. There are quite a number of people who were judicially hanged at Calvary Cemetery, but almost all of them are in one particular section over here. Over here along the side, going up against the wall on the southern end of the cemetery. There's a wide and largely unmarked section where quite a few of the people who were hanged and ended up at Calvary are in here. James Tracy, the murderer we looked up a while ago. He's the guy that they pumped full of electricity on the slab to see if they could wake him back up back in the early 1880s. This is Buff Higgins. Buff Higgins is a guy who was arrested because they needed somebody to pin a murder on. He was what they called a police character. He was always being brought in for, small-time robberies and stuff. But once they arrested him for this murder, they didn't really have much to pin on him, so they threw him in a cell, left him there without food or water for a few days, then poured a whole pint of whiskey down his throat, and put a piece of paper in front of him saying, hey, this is your alibi statement, Buff, just sign this and you're free to go. Now, he was, of course, starving and horribly drunk, not to mention he couldn't read in the first place, so he didn't realize that what he was signing was actually a confession. He was hanged on the strength of that confession. Judge Goggins ended up writing a whole thing about this. This was just very common at the time that the police's job was to get a conviction by any means necessary, whether it was the right person or not. Kind of a similar case. Over here in the same section is Giovanni Ansari, one of a number of people who were called the Trunk Murderers of 1885. These guys were accused of, 3 Italian men were accused of slitting another Italian man's throat and putting him in a trunk and mailing him to Pittsburgh. Now, by no means did these guys get a fair trial. They were defended in court, while Giovanni Ansari was by Kate Kane Rossi, the only woman working in Chicago at the time. Now, they did not get a fair trial by any means. This was all very well covered by Andrea Dale's book, Elizabeth Dale's book, The Chicago Trunk Murder. Now, this one, there's an excellent chance, there's a chance that they might have done it. They couldn't have really any other suspects. But they were absolutely railroaded in any case. And while we're on the subject, this was a little after the Trunk Murder in Buff Higgins' days. Higgins actually shared a cell for a while with Prendergast. But down here at Oakwood Cemetery on the south side is George M. Shippey, chief of police in the early 20th century, known as a real weirdo. He was always coming up with weird stuff to try. Here he is with Johann Hawk, and also Coroner Hoffman's over on the side there. That's Shippey on the left. One of the detectives next to him, then Johann Hawk reclining in the chair. We'll cover Johann Hawk a little bit more later. Now, just before the Hawk case in early 1905, There had been a case where a body washed ashore on Lake Michigan, up in the Rogers Park area. Now, this body had been stabbed several times. At first, they might have thought it was a drowning. Then they realized, no, you don't usually get stabbed after you drown. It was a guy by the name of Silafani. There were a number of different suspects, and Shippey tried all kinds of things to try to figure out who it might have been, up to and including renting a horse that he thought might have been involved in the murder to see if the horse would magically take him to the actual killer. It didn't work. Eventually, he reportedly propped up Silafani's body at Mount Carmel Cemetery in the receiving vault, had it positioned so it was pointing. And one by one, he brought in the suspects to have them to be pointed out by the corpse, hoping he would scare one of them into confessing. Which, again, didn't work. Now, this was reported in several different papers at the time, but not the most sensationalist paper, the Chicago American at the time. Morticians that I've talked to doubt that it would be particularly possible. It would definitely be really unpleasant if they tried it. But a few years later, he had the last day of his career. He was living up on Hudson Street in this house that is still standing. At the time, it had an awning over it. You can see the little... go back and forth. You can see from the top of it, it's the same house, and the shapes on the windows. The little canopy over the door is now gone. But the stairs are still there. But late one night, he was in his house, and there was a knock at the door. The servants admitted a guy by the name of Lazarus Averbach. We'll point out right here that the plaque by the door says, in memory of Lazarus Averbach, who emigrated from Russia in 1908 and died here shortly thereafter. Now, they avoided, there's definitely a contingent of people who absolutely hate this plaque, but they avoided getting too political with it or really accusing Shippey of anything particular. What happened was Lazarus Averbach, exactly what the heck he was doing at Shippey's house is not known. Shippey didn't really give him a chance to ask. He just saw him and decided to shoot. He decided he looked like an anarchist. He looked Jewish, which at the time meant anarchist. So he shot him to death. Shippey never served another day after this. It was kind of, the cops appear to have planted some evidence to make it look like it was all self-defense. Newspapers bulked it up to make him look like he was a much tougher and bigger guy than he was. Whole books about it were written at the time. And Averbach is in a little Jewish cemetery off Pulaski, right near Bohemian National, just up the road from it, Ridgeland. There's a bunch of old disused headstones over there that have fallen apart. And one for, they call him Jerome on that. Jane Addams was involved in getting him a burial. Well, we're talking about police chiefs. We'll move in a little bit here to Rose Hill Cemetery. Up at the edge of the 7th grade section, right past the geologist Cumming Cherry, just beyond the elocutionist Robert Cumnock, and inventor A.B. Dick. John J. Badenoch. This is what I stumbled on entirely by accident while I was working on the H.H. Holmes book. Thinking, J.J. Badenoch, you old so-and-so, there you are. Now, J.J. Badenoch became chief of police in 1895. Not that he had any experience in this. He was a flour and feed dealer. As I always say, the new mayor gave him the job as chief of police just because he liked the cut of his jib. And at the time, this was not controversial. It wasn't controversial to have a new chief of police who had never been a cop, who was not a lawyer, who had no background in criminology or anything that would lend itself to police work. But he wasn't a part of the force, and the force was so famously corrupt at the time that it seemed logical to bring in somebody from the outside. So he became chief of police just in time for the investigation into the house of H. Holmes down on 63rd Street. And this is part of why the legend of Holmes' house, the murder castle building, grew so far and wide out of proportion. The police ran around the place for a few days thinking, hey, we found a rope, maybe he was hanging people. We found a shaft, this could have been for lowering bodies. Now, honestly, they could do the same thing in just about any large building anywhere. You walk around, it's something that's kind of sobering to think of, is that you could make a murder castle from the things you find at home. But Badenoch, not really having any idea what he was doing, went around the place with his men and thought, I've solved every crime of the last 10 years. Among those people involved was Detective Fitzpatrick, who is now at Mount Olivet Cemetery down on the south side. Stumbled upon him by accident. I just had it in my head, maybe that's that Fitzpatrick, which was really a shot in the dark because this is an Irish Catholic cemetery. There's a lot of Fitzpatricks in this place. But here's Detective Fitzpatrick. But after his investigation was winding down, really, the New York World published their famous article, Castle of a Modern Bluebeard, which had this diagram with names of the rooms in the building, enabled things like the Room of the Three Corpses, the Death Shaft, the Maze, the Black Closet, the Dummy Elevator for lowering bodies. Some of this just came out of their own imagination. But one guy who was also on that same investigation remained with the force for almost 40 more years. And that was a guy named John W. Norton, who is now at All Saints Cemetery. We'll pretend that's his silhouette there in the fedora and the trench coat. But Detective John W. Norton, who almost became really like the Columbo of the Chicago police force in the early 20th century. Almost every big murder case of the 1900s and the 1910s and into the 1920s. In the 1920s, he was going up against the Capones. He staged a raid on Ralph Capone's place where they found guns hidden in the curtain rods and secret compartments all over. You gotta wonder if he flashed back to his time investigating the H. Holmes castle at the time. But all through that period, there's story after story where he would break a case by acting like a buddy for a while, then just pulling there's just one more thing that I don't understand. One famous case is cracking the murder of Ruth Wanderer, who was buried off of the edge of Mausoleum Row down here at Graceland Cemetery. We'll just watch the train go by there. Our daughter, Ruth Ann Wanderer. Here she is with her husband, Carl Wanderer, who shot her to death one night and tried to blame the whole thing on a drifter whom he had also shot to death. Carl's story was that, this drifter jumped out from the vestibule at our house and pulled a gun on me, so I pulled a gun of my own, and I shot him, but not before he could shoot my wife. He and the drifter had just cooked this whole thing up. He wanted to punch the drifter out and look like a hero in front of his wife, or something. That was the story he told the drifter anyway. Exactly what his motivations are on. There's a lot of different stories. I've been all the way through his trial transcript and everything. Nothing exactly makes sense. But here's Carl Wanderer himself. And for a couple of days, the newspapers acted like he was a real hero. It was Detective Sergeant John W. Norton who cracked the case and figured out that there was something fishy here right away. Said, now, Carl, don't you think it's weird that you and the drifter had the same model of gun? And they're just a couple of serial numbers off? And Carl got flustered. I don't know what I was thinking, saying that the drifter had a gun. I pulled out 2 guns, and he took one of them away from me. Okay, well, so Carl, how come you took 2 guns with you when you took your wife to the movies? And nowadays, he'd probably just be like, well, that's all I could carry, and that would probably work for people, unfortunately. But eventually, he broke down and confessed. He was hanged in 1921, went to the grave with a song on his lips. Norton retired a few years later, being one of the only police officers on the force who had a decades-long career and never had a serious accusation of corruption. Now, am I doing on time here? Let's skip ahead a bit. Let's go back down to Oakwood Cemetery again. Down here among the mausoleums is the guy who was the Vice Lord of Chicago in the 1910s, Big Jim Colosimo. If you were running a numbers racket or a brothel or any kind of vice ring in Chicago in the 1910s, you were probably paying off Big Jim, who ran a cafe on Wabash Street. It was opera singers for a while, then eventually the jazz singers would start in and people would start to dance. Now, 1920 rolled around and he supposedly got everybody together and said, "Listen, boys, I don't think we should do bootleg liquor. I mean, I know that's going to be a big thing. I know you all want to get into the bootleg liquor racket, but listen, for one thing, this is going to be the feds, not the local cops. It's a lot harder to bribe. Second of all, I just got married to one of my singers. I'm trying to straighten up and fly right. So, I mean, we're still going to do the brothels. We're still going to do the gambling. But bootleg liquor, not on my watch." Shortly after saying that, he was shot to death in his cafe by an assailant unknown. The standard solution was that Capone and Torrio brought in Frankie Yale, Capone's old mentor from New York, to do the job. Personally, I think Frankie Yale was really too high up the ladder to be doing this kind of grunt work, but at the same time, it's also said that he just liked doing this kind of grunt work. Detective Norton interviewed the widow, Dale Winter Colosimo, and said, "Do you suspect anyone?" And she said, "I should say I suspect everyone." Here is a Bathhouse John Coughlin leading the mourning. And here's the interesting thing that I always want to point out. When you go inside, you can see the slab there, James Colosimo, 1919. Which is odd because he did not die in 1919, he died in 1920. Typos on gravestones are way more common than you'd think, especially one that was going inside. They probably had to figure nobody's ever going to see this anyway, other than the other 5 times they might open this thing. Little did they guess that here we are, 103 years later, still telling the story. In fact, it's right about at the anniversary. A couple of weeks from now will be a week or so. It will be the 103rd anniversary. But now we've got to move up to Mount Carmel Cemetery, or move out to Mount Carmel Cemetery on the west side in Hillside. This is Michael Merlot, who in the early 1920s was head of the Unione Siciliana. This was officially a Sicilian civic organization, but it became so big and so powerful that it effectively by the mid-1920s was really just a front for the mob. Whoever was in control of the Unione was in control of the mob. The mob did not want to make any moves without getting approval from whoever was the head of the Unione. Now, initially, when Colosimo was out of the way, John Torrio got everybody together and said, "Listen, we are definitely going to do bootleg liquor. What we're not going to do is fight. We're going to divide the city up into territories. You take yours, we'll take ours. Plenty of money for everybody." And this worked for a while. But eventually they did start wanting to shoot each other. Even then, Torrio didn't dream of going against Dino Banyan, even though Dino Banyan had been double-crossing him as the head of the North Side mob, because Merlot didn't want any fighting. But then, Mike Merlot died of natural causes. In November of 1924, he'd be about the last head of the Unione Siciliana to die of natural causes for quite a while. After this, they would just be assassinated one after the other. And just weeks after the fact, just days after Mike Merlot's death, in fact, Dino Banyan, head of the North Side mob, was working his day job at Schofield's Flowers. A few guys came in, he said, "Hey boys, you here for Merlot's?" They thought they were gathering up the many, many flowers that were used for the beer here. And the 3 guys shot him down. O'Banion himself is now not too far away from Mike Merlot. The larger version of his obelisk. There he is, Dean O'Banion. There he is being carted out of Schofield's Flowers. Now, once again, we don't know exactly who the shooters were in the O'Banion case. There's a lot of different theories. One, the guys who I think it was blamed on a lot, would have been the Jenna brothers, who are also at Mount Carmel Cemetery. Most of the gangsters ended up at Mount Carmel. It was the one Catholic cemetery that they didn't have much trouble getting taken by. The Jenna brothers, after the death of Dino Banyan, the Jenna brothers officially worked for Capone. They were operating all over Little Italy. They'd found a loophole in the prohibition law saying that you could still manufacture rubbing alcohol. So they were paying people really good money to manufacture rubbing alcohol in their basement, a lot more than they'd make working in factories. But Tony Jenna was shot outside of a grocery store. Angelo Jenna and Mike Jenna were also killed, ended up here in this mausoleum. Now, at the funeral of one of these guys, Genevieve Forbes Herrick, the Chicago Tribune's ace crime reporter at the time, overheard a guy saying, "There's Mike and Dean and Jenna," and also noted Mike Merlot was right. Mike Merlot and Dino Banyan and Jenna. "When Judgment Day comes and them 3 graves are open, there'll be hell to pay in this cemetery." This was just the beginning. Mount Carmel, as I said, became the place to be buried if you were a gangster. It's the greatest irony of them all. They buried him out in the suburbs. Right up here we got Jaime Weiss. North Sider, one of a few guys who took over for Dino Banyan on the north side, then a couple of years later was shot right across the street outside a Holy Name Cathedral. Now, various tours like to say that this is a bullet hole still at Holy Name Cathedral. It is not. There used to be a plaque being held up. There was a lighting tube right there. But there are places underneath there where you can kind of see where they had to rebuild the entire cornerstone area because it was so damaged by machine gun fire. Now, this is not the kind of hole you get out of a Tommy gun. It'd be a much bigger blast. One of the other guys who took over for Dino Banyan was Vinny the Schemer Drucci. They called him the Schemer because he was always coming up with wild schemes like, "Hey, why don't we run one of our guys for mayor? Or why don't we go to London and steal the crown jewels?" I would have been okay with that, honestly. Under his real name of Vincent D'Ambrosio. Now, eventually, during one of the elections, the gangsters were so known to interfere with elections that one election day they just said, "Okay, round up all the usual suspects." So they arrested him just out and walking around. The official story was he'd been reaching for a cop's gun, so the cop shot him. There were those who doubted the story, but nobody really pressed the issue particularly hard. And of course, some years later, also at Mount Carmel, would be the Capone plot. Capone was initially buried out in Mount Olivet Cemetery. There's still a gravestone for him there, and there are those who insist he was never really moved. But this is the Capone family plot. There's some of the Capone family. There's a lot of conflicting accounts as to who's who in this particular picture. Well, that's Al Capone at the age of 25. Now, recently somebody spray painted the word evil on this, and I always say, just do a dance on it. You're just going to have somebody from the cemetery clean it up anyway. Here's Al Capone at about the age of 30. And right next to it is his brother Ralph Capone. And there's Detective Sean Norton going through Ralph Capone's stuff. Now, of course, one thing they could never pin on Capone, even though they assumed he was behind it, was 1929, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, when 7 guys in the Bugs Moran gang were lined up against the wall here at the SMC Cartage Company on Clark and shot to death. Now, 5 of these guys were people who worked for the gang. One other was just a mechanic that they hired sometimes, but wasn't really a part of it. And then there was the Reinhard Schwimmer, a guy who officially was not a part of the gang. He was a young optometrist who just thought it was cool to hang out with gangsters. Or so the story goes. He is now at Rose Hill Cemetery. Let's wander over to his spot. Reinhard Schwimmer, who officially was not a part of the gang, his wife Josephine is still alive at 155. Go Josephine, go. But most of why we think he wasn't in the gang really is because his mommy said so. Always a good boy, doctor's mother sobs. Uh-huh. Well, let's move on. I got so many things in this deck. Actually, we'll move over from Schwimmer just briefly. One of the most notable true crimes in United States history. Well, you can see we're backing away here. Josephine, I don't think was his wife. I think that would have been, years-wise, I think that would have been his mother. But just a short walk away is the unassuming grave of Catherine Evans, who had the first line on stage at Ford's Theater in Our American Cousin the night that Abraham Lincoln was shot. Now, in addition to Lincoln being shot that night, Booth and his gang had a whole plot to murder everybody of any consequence, including the Secretary of State, William Seward. One of the doctors who attended to Seward, after he was stabbed and very nearly killed, was John Wilson, who is now at Graceland Cemetery, and ended up in possession of the knife. Now, while we're at Graceland, the older one up at the top here is John Kinsey, who by most accounts was Chicago's first murderer. Killed a rival fur trader by the name of Jean Lalim. Officially, it was self-defense, though one witness at the time described it as a perfect assassination. But the War of 1812 kind of covered up innumerable sins. They've got a little marker for the War of 1812 at his grave. I wouldn't have put it there myself. He may have committed some light treason. We'll zip over to the other side. I don't know of any particular crimes associated with Eternal Silence, a statue built by Henry Graves, marking the plot of his family, including his father Dexter. It's always said that this is Dexter Graves' plot. It's really more Henry's. What we want to cover really is the field back behind it. For one thing, there's another guy way out in the field here. This is all, it looks like space for future use, but it's mostly single graves. People bought these wanting either a very unintrusive marker or more often no marker at all. One of them was a guy named Hutchinson who was accused of being part of the Lincoln conspiracy. And also, this is the old courthouse. Among the people here, there's a guy by the name of George Driver. He's about the only person I know of at Graceland Cemetery who was executed, who was hanged. A guy named George Driver got drunk and killed his ex-wife. He was hanged and eventually buried out here, hanged to that old courthouse. There's perhaps the ugliest mob that Chicago has seen for many a day, assembled on Clark Street in front of the jail and around the old courthouse square today. It consisted of old and young, men and women, boys and girls. In its ranks were mustered the most depraved and bedraggled specimens of humanity the city could furnish. 3/4 of the uncouth rabble were boys, principally from the southern and western districts of this city, young scoundrels upon whose brow the devil appeared to have set his seals to give the world assurance of unmitigated scoundrelism. A dozen policemen under the command of Roundsman Brown did duty on the west side of Clark Street and around the east wing. They managed to keep the villainous crowd at bay and compelled them to align their ruffian ranks in the center of Clark Street. From the middle of the line of that thoroughfare, the houses on the east side. They had just switched at this time to doing private executions. Before that, as I mentioned, they did a couple of them right in the middle of Ashland. But elsewhere in the field, there's quite a number of interesting cases in the field here. One is a guy by the name of Henry Harris. 1867, Henry Harris was a black man who had come to Chicago a few years before from North Carolina, probably escaping from slavery, though the records on that kind of thing are always going to be shaky. He was having his fortune told when the shop at which he was having his fortune told was raided. He ran off. Officer Reuben Slayton chased him down and beat the hell out of him, and he died that night. Now, this is something that came up at the time. This isn't the newest thing. A brutal police officer. The Chicago Tribune said that officer had no more business being on the police force than a burglar had being on the Supreme Court. Long pause and a drink. But Slayton was given a slap on the wrist. He got like a 30-day suspension for the whole thing. I've been lobbying them to get a marker for Harris out here. It's a name that we ought to be saying out loud more. But Slayton ended up staying with the force. In fact, 20 years later, he arrested one of the Haymarket people, who are now at the same cemetery he is at Forest Home out on the west side. This is also where a number of these people are. But while we're here, elsewhere, further back in the cemetery, well, I had to drive to this one over and over again early in the lockdown period. Just because it got flooded. There were a lot of rains at the time, if you might remember. There would be like ducks swimming over this space. Yesy. But this unmarked grave over here is the plot of Belle Gunness. A few days ago, while we were on the road, we went to the site of Belle's farm in LaPorte, Indiana, then to a nearby cemetery that had a marker for her unknown victims. Belle got her start killing people for insurance money here in Chicago, but with the money she made, she bought a farm in LaPorte, started taking out ads in matrimonial agencies and luring people out there saying, "You're going to love my farm, you'll love me, come prepared to stay forever, and bring all of your cash sewn into your underwear." How many people she might have killed at this place is really unknown. They found dozens of bodies buried there, probably in the range of 30 to 40 people. The farmhouse burned down. They found a body that they decided was hers, but it was headless, and they never found the head. So we have to assume that if she really died in this fire, she cut off her own head and hid it really good before the fire broke out. So the Chicago American was publishing pictures like, here's how she might look disguised as a man. This is Ray Lamphere, one of the servants who kind of got the rap for all of this. But here is Belle herself. She was exhumed about 15 years ago. There's now talk about doing it herself to see if it was actually her in there. They found a couple of kids in the coffin with her, which they did not expect. Nobody wrote about that at the time. And they cover this in pretty good detail. Now, they did find that the body there was about the right size. One of the urban legends about it was that the body was completely the wrong height. That turned out not to be the case. They tried to match the DNA to the tiny bits that they could get of letters that Belle would have licked, like envelopes that she licked. The results were inconclusive, but I understand that there's some talk now of exhuming her again. And I am well over time now. We're just going to go really quick here. If you've been on the Patreon this week, we've been talking all about Thomas Neal Cream, one of our earlier serial killers in Chicago. Killed people such as Alice Montgomery, and shortly after he killed Alice Montgomery here in Chicago, he killed Daniel Stott, who is now buried out in Garden Prairie Cemetery, one of my favorite gravestones anywhere. It says, "Poisoned by his wife and Dr. Cream." So rarely do you see a murder mystery carved onto a headstone. And of course, we talked about Johann Hawk a little earlier on, too. Johann Hawk was a guy who would meet a woman, marry her, take her money, and run, all in the space of about a week. When they caught up with him in New York, they thought he had already proposed to what would have been wife number 55. Near as I can tell, it was probably more like 20. There's 20 that I can confirm, and 5 that he probably killed, usually using arsenic poisoning. Here he is in jail. Hawkter man. But there are a number of graves associated with him. He's buried approximately this general vicinity out at Elmwood Cemetery on the west side. He was initially at Dunning Cemetery. They couldn't find a cemetery that would take him. They spent all day driving his corpse around before eventually burying him at Dunning until they found this place, and then moved him about 48 hours later. But back at Oakwood Cemetery is the last victim, Marie Walker, who was a divorcee, a German immigrant divorcee, whose husband, apparently her previous husband, tried to kill her all the time, according to the divorce paperwork. This being before the no-fault divorce clause. People were known to exaggerate things a lot in divorce claims. But this one also has the paperwork also includes a letter to him at jail. So he'd been in and out. He met her through a personal ad, married her days after meeting her, that administered arsenic. And there's Marie. There's actually a shot of her being exhumed and featuring Inspector Shippey, who we've talked about already. It was almost a decade since his first Chicago victim, Julia Steinbrecher, also known as Marie Steinbrecher. But in her grave here is Marie Hawk. He met her shortly after coming to Chicago. He was working at a tavern where there is now a Walgreens. And she's actually just to the left of the one marked grave over here. A physician or a coroner or some official tried to stop the funeral procession as it made its way to Graceland on the suspicion that Maria had been poisoned, but Hawk was able to pull out a death certificate saying that she died of natural causes, and that was that. The cabinet card that they posed for gives us probably our best view, probably the best picture we've got of Hawk. And with that, with me being over time now, we will just start hanging out. I haven't got another one listed right now. The schedule is just so in flux right now, but I think we'll be back on Thursday night. Right now, we've been going back and forth. Lenora, one of our Mysterians, is in the hospital. I won't get into too many details, but we've been back and forth to Cleveland so much lately. I'm kind of forgetting what day it is, etc. But we will just put this up. Normally, I'd post the upcoming tours here, but right now, it'll just be this. But I think we will run on Thursday night. So with that, everybody, I will put the Benny Goodman back on, and we will just hang out. Thanks for joining me, everybody. Yes, Marie. Who will avenge the Maries? The thing is, in Germany in those days, nearly every woman was named Marie or Anna. And then they'd have like a middle name that they usually went by. Every man was Johann, and they go by something else. They go by their middle name. Now, one thing that makes the Hawk story difficult to know is that every woman in it went by at least 5 different names. Susan, I'll get Miles out at least in a second. New Cat's settling in about as well as can be expected. She's kind of hiding under the couch right now. You know, New Cat's always wanted just a very small area to patrol. But there hasn't been any big fights. Alright, bug. Me without my chopsticks. Yes, so far, Miles and Priya have both just kind of stared at Lily. Lily's just kind of trying to hold her ground, but they haven't tried to be mean to her or anything. They're giving her space, which is really what she needs right now. Now, my cats are a little more used because Sammy and Rosie, they're moving out shortly. Yeah, Lenora's in the hospital, so we have moved her cat in with us. So little Lily is underneath the couch right now. And here comes Miles. I was just going to go find you, Miles. But here he is. Lily is a little white cat. Well, and yeah, Lily is eating. I don't know if she's gone out for water yet, but she knows where it is. Yeah, Miles has been pretty good. He hasn't tried to hiss at her. Sometimes he hisses at Sammy and Rosie. So yeah, in this house right now, there's a Rosie and a Lily. We just needed a Daisy. With a little green light at the end of her pier. Kendra, Lily is Lenora's cat. but she'll be living with us for a while. Thanks to everybody donating. It's been a week. Rosie and Sammy are the upstairs cats who come hang out now and then. Part of the fun of apartment living, really. And Miles and Priya, they've both gone to stare at her a little bit here and there, but they're giving her space. And poor Lily's had quite an upheaval. Whole new space, different kinds of floors, roommates for the first time, long car ride. But they're coexisting pretty well so far. Good night, Bella. Who are you calling a weirdo?
Down Harlem Way, they're all trucking. And here's Helen Ward to tell you all about her. Trucking.
Here's Miles. Now, Lily's still mostly hiding, but it's what I expected, really. Cats in new places. They can be shy. But she purrs if you go to pet her. Mostly. We tried to put her up in the cat tree earlier, and, well, she'll let Aiden carry her. The rest of us don't. Well, yeah, there's lots of new windows for her to sit in here. Lots of different views out of lots of different windows. Birds to watch, people walking dogs, cars. There's a park out back. Oh, Miles, you're always knocking down the Bruce Springsteen album. Well, yeah, Bella, Kristen makes a good point. You don't get them wet. Or feed them after midnight. It's always midnight somewhere. Miles is just purring and purring. Good night, Heather. I'm gonna turn the bedding down a bit so you can maybe I'll hear Miles purring. Casey, I really can't tell. Miles, what are you doing? Are you knocking the Bruce over? Or making requests over here? You want to hear some Spirit in the Night? Blinded by the Light? Carol, yeah, I sent you a message. There was a whiskey and a cookie. It was going. Good night, Kristen. Oh, here we go. Miles is just purring away over here today. Yeah, I think you know where all those buttons are by now. You're getting fur all over the place. But people like to see you. Leah, we won't tell. It is shedding season. Lily has definitely been shedding. Miles, you are making me allergic. Yes, you are. Yeah, Octavio, I remember one time Eli got in a lot of trouble for telling the cat that she sheds too much, and my mom overheard incorrectly. And she came storming into his room. To her credit, she quickly realized the mistake. Oh yeah, cat hair all over me now. Is what it is. But alright, everybody. Tomorrow should be Find a Grave Friday. I got to drive around to some appointments. It's going to be a bit of a trick, but this is what I do. So I will be seeing you guys soon. I will see you in the morning in any case. What button was that? Oh, that's Al Capone's multiplication test in jail. He had really he was kind of losing his mind by then. But alright, yeah, cat hair on clothes is perfectly normal. So alright, everybody, thanks a lot for joining me once again. I'm Adam from Mysterious Chicago Tours. Look up the book I Beat Up Charles Dickens over on Amazon. And until tomorrow, everybody, stay safe and stay warm and stay dry. And of course, if you can, everybody, you gotta stay spooky. Have a great night. Yes, I need a mysterious helicopter. Mysterian helicopter. Mysterian helicopter. So, man.